Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit of our story from Austin, Travis County with y'all. Looking at the lineup, I know we've got some really experienced folks on the call, so I'll try to highlight some of the things that we're doing that might be non-typical for what we've seen in CWPPs in the past, and tie this into where we are now in implementing that CWPP. And then I'll stick around if there's any questions that others might have for me throughout the call. So what I really wanted to focus on during this presentation is integrated community wildfire planning, with CWPPs being a platform for that. Our current Austin Travis County Wildfire Protection Plan is a major step in developing a regional strategy aligned with national best practices to increase wildfire preparedness. This is a quote from our CWPP by one of our community leaders. And so the takeaway for us in Austin, a little bit of background, is we've got about 1 million people in the city proper, with about 2 million in the county as a whole. From a risk standpoint, about 60% of the structures have been defined at risk from wildfire across the county. And because of our development patterns, which are atypical for Texas, if you didn't know, Texas is 97% privately owned. Austin's unique that we have 30% of our land base set aside in conservation easements or wildland areas. So we, unlike other parts of Texas, we have a permanent built wildland urban interface. Our wildfire boundary throughout the city is over 600 linear miles of areas that abut wildlands. So we've got a really significant wildfire risk. If you look at it through just about any lens of analysis, I'll mention the recent CoreLogic report that listed Austin as 5th highest probability for major structure and economic losses associated with wildfire. The other top 4 communities on that list were all in California. So it really started with understanding our situation. In 2011, we experienced what was the worst wildfire in Texas history, right down the road from us, which is featured in this picture in the background of Austin skyline, was the Bastrop fire, which was the worst fire in Texas history, and at the time, the 3rd worst per capita economic loss fire in the country. And so that built a lot of awareness at a local level that wildfire might be a reality for us and that we needed to do something proactive to address it. So City Council established the Wildfire Division in 2013, and we've been working diligently since then to ensure that Austin's resilient from the impacts of wildfire. And so that really starts, any conversation around action starts with understanding the issue, and that's no different for wildfire. We did a lot of research going into our process to be able to understand and communicate that risk. We looked at it through multiple lenses. We looked at from a climate prediction standpoint of what will our future look like, and that scared us. And I think anybody that read the report, we got listed as Austin's a poster child for urban wildfire threat in climate.org's report. But we reinforced that with local analysis of our long-term impacts, and what that indicated is that very clearly 2012 was going to be our new normal. And so we had to develop a platform for really understanding this risk and being able to communicate it to our public, our leadership, internally to our department, our partners and cooperators. So everybody had a common operating picture of what that wildfire risk was. So the first step in our CWPP process was to form a working group or a task force with stakeholders that were invested in reducing the impacts from wildfire. To be quite honest, when this working group first was established, there was a lot of concern about the impacts of wildfire mitigation on critical environmental features. Austin has over 28 threatened or endangered species that we have to account for. So initially, it was really a checks and balances to make sure that wildfire mitigation didn't bowl over other values. And through that process, we built that common operating picture. We established trust amongst ourselves and a commitment to move forward collaboratively to address this risk. And really, I think everybody knows this, that effectively we're not dealing with wildfire, we're dealing with people impacted by wildfire. And so collaboration is really the key. We recognized in the city of Austin that our WUI boundary wasn't necessarily under our control. Much of those wildlands are managed by Travis County, the county seat that we're located in. So it was essential that we engage community members and partners at a broader level than just our jurisdiction. So we decided to develop our community wildfire protection plan based on a county-wide model versus just specific for the city of Austin. And that gave us a lot more ownership and buy-in. The screenshot you're seeing and the link below is the link to our Austin Travis County Wildfire Coalition webpage, where we direct residents and others from across the city and county to find the information they need to prepare themselves for wildfire. Our coalition consisted of folks from emergency services, land managers, city planners, emergency managers, and many other stakeholders at the state and federal level. I think if anything going into it, over-inclusivity may have been an issue, but we wanted to make sure that everybody was heard and their concerns and values were reflected in that plan. So we worked really hard to bring together a good solid working group with a common operating picture of understanding those impacts. We also sought to ensure that we had leadership intent for these efforts, that it wasn't just an internal planning process. So our city council in Austin and the Travis County Commissioners Court both adopted the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, and we reinforced that with a local resolution by our Public Safety Commission and City Council that directs city leadership to make this a priority. So it's not just our job, it's everyone's job in Austin. And those priorities were standard elements of both the cohesive strategy and CWPPs to prioritize and focus on fuels mitigation that gives us the greatest benefit for protecting our communities and wildlands. Local level CWPPs, we didn't stop at a countywide level. We push our plans down to a grassroots level to ensure that communities have localized strategies and ownership of their part of the solution, as well as us understanding ours. We knew that codification of wildfire best practices was the most assured approach to sustainable mitigation over time. Since the inception of our Wildfire Coalition, I would say 3/4 of the original participants have moved on, moved up, or gone elsewhere. And so it's been really important that we solidify what we do in practices and code and not just in relationships. And then the third element was to ensure that we had an effective response, evacuation, and pre-response plans in place. Make sure we cover all elements of that cohesive national wildfire strategy. So a little bit about our efforts at the local level. We work really closely with our communities. We're leading the state in the number of nationally recognized firewise sites, and each of those firewise sites has a full-blown community wildfire protection plan. Currently, 43% of high wildfire risk areas are covered by a local CWPP, but we've got engagement in about 80% of those high wildfire risk areas. So we're working really hard to expand that footprint. And then we've also looked at it from an alternate perspective of not just who's most at risk, but who's most vulnerable to the impacts of wildfire. And we worked with Headwaters Economics to develop a wildfire vulnerability viewer. So that helps us dial in and target underserved communities, those that might be mobility impaired, have high sensitivity to smoke impacts and other factors, not just direct wildfire impacts. So we wanted to broaden our efforts to be as inclusive as possible. We also work really diligently to implement fuels mitigation projects on city property as our first priority. And then we also provide technical expertise for private landowners and communities with common areas to design their fuels mitigation projects. We use a practice called shaded fuel breaks, which is different than you see in a lot of other parts of the country, where we work to maintain the canopy cover, but reduce the ladder fuel and surface fuels, so we have less likelihood of fire traveling into the canopy, but we maintain that shade so we don't get exorbitant amounts of surface and flashy fuels. We recently spent this downtime with COVID to evaluate all potential treatable areas within the city and have identified almost 200 projects that we're lining out now. Through the ArcGIS dashboard, you can get a view of our shaded fuel break story map and the work we're doing in that arena. We also focus very heavily on wildfire evacuation and response pre-planning. For a lot of folks, it really helps them to understand the downstream impacts of wildfire. And we all know that could be a threat to your life and your safety. So we often start the conversation with evacuation planning to imbibe a sense of urgency. To facilitate that, we've developed the first city-county wildfire evacuation plan, which was one of the first recommendations in our CWPP. We identified the limited ingress and egress communities across Austin and Travis County, as well as our evacuation routes. And we're working to build community-specific evacuation plan and pre-response plans. Part of that planning was to identify community refuge areas. If you've been in Austin in the afternoon, we're in gridlock from about 3 to 7. We also know that's our peak burning period in Texas for wildfires. So many of our communities don't have options to leave the community to get to a safe evacuation route. So we've worked to identify community refuge areas where we can temporarily shelter people in the event of evacuation complexities arising. And then one of the things we really want to focus on is codifying our efforts. If you've had a similar experience, I've spent a lot of time working with partners, building those relationships, only to have them move on to another role and start from scratch. And after learning the hard way over and over again, we realized that we really have to codify this and make it part of our culture in our community and not just something that we convince someone that's important to do. So one of our most recent accomplishments and efforts, it's twofold, is to update the city's land development code, and that was one of our CWPP recommendations, and that helped us address things like ingress and egress. And so we will no longer see communities in Austin allowed to be designed without multiple access points for first responders and for the public. We did a lot of work in the land use code to update some of our criteria manuals that spoke to vegetation, landscaping, and materials. And then most specifically, we recently adopted the Wildland Urban Interface Code. If you're familiar with the ICC WUI code, it's a model code, and it's a great starting place. And for some communities, especially communities without any fire code, it's designed to be a standalone fire code. So it addresses issues that if you're in a major municipality like Austin, our water supply issues are covered in other code. So we really worked to boil the WUI code down to what it needed to be as succinctly and clearly for us, and use that model code as a framework, but develop in partnership with ICC local amendments that really worked for us. And so one of the things that we decided was really important is to protect structures and communities, not just adjacent to wildlands, but in that ember debris field where we know we have potential spotting into communities with receptacle fuel beds. Just about every home to date in Austin's got a wooden fence around it or a fuse. And so we really wanted to look at those weak links that we have that aren't covered in the code. So we expanded our requirements for WUI code compliance to 1.5 miles from any wildland area, 750 acres or larger, to cover that threat of embers spreading into the communities. If you're located directly adjacent to a wildland area or within 150 feet of an area 40 acres or larger, you have to do 100% structure hardening for the entirety of the structure. If you're outside of that zone, but within 1.5 miles, it requires ember-resistant ventilation, gutters, fencing, things that we know can be really susceptible during a wildfire. And according to ICC, Austin is the largest municipality outside of California to have adopted the Wildland Code, Urban Interface Code. Our target date for implementation is January 1st. And one of the things we're adamant about is that we didn't pass this code as an unfunded mandate. And so we built into this process a budget request for additional plans review engineers and inspectors, because when we met with our stakeholders, the real estate and the building community, they said there's one thing that will cause us to not support this, and that's if you slow the development process down. we can handle a little bit increased cost and complexity, but if you slow the process down, that's when it becomes a problem for us. So we made a commitment to our partners, to our leadership, that we wouldn't move forward without adequate resources to implement the code. And our council, to their credit, has been very supportive and very proactive in supporting these efforts and the adequate resources. So we're really excited of moving into this new phase. We know it's going to come with challenges. We know we still have a lot to learn, to refine this process, but having in place and having a start date is a good launch pad to refine our efforts related to the code and regulation. I mentioned, as we're talking about planning, early in the process of how we integrated our community wildfire protection plan. One level that I mentioned is that we developed it with a cohesive strategy in mind. And so all of the tenets of our CWPP align with that national cohesive strategy, as to our local level plans. We also work to integrate the CWPP as the hazard mitigation annex for our city and county hazard mitigation plan. We developed a wildfire response plan for our emergency operations plan for the city and county. We integrated wildfire considerations into our council mandated climate resiliency and sustainability planning efforts, our urban forestry plan, our area land management plans. And so one of our goals was to make sure that our plan was not just our plan, that it was reflected in other partners' plans and vice versa. And really what that meant for us is, if we were asking those partners to show up at our meetings and support our efforts, then how can in kind we turn around and support them in protecting and preserving the values that they hold dear. So myself and my staff spend a large amount of time serving on city working groups, our urban forestry leadership team, our interdepartmental green infrastructure priority program, things along those lines to contribute back, and also to help elucidate how wildfire can impact others' values. And so we worked really diligently to leverage that CWPP to embed those priorities or values into our partners' planning. And I think one of the challenges for me in my past has been communicating successes associated with our efforts, tracking those efforts and effectiveness of those implementations, evaluating where we are in that process of implementation, and ensuring that we have adequate funding to sustain those efforts. To do that, we've recently developed the Austin Area Wildfire Hub, and I've included a link, but I'm going to give a disclaimer. We're not going live with this hub for another few days, so hold on to that. You'll get a sneak peek. This is a ArcGIS-based tool that gives us opportunity not to just share data, but to interact with the public, to give them access and a platform for things like developing their local level CWPP and feeding that with our risk maps, communicating where our projects are happening on the ground in real time, where our community engagement events are occurring and how you can get involved, understanding your wildfire risk and how that relates to the things that you care most about, and making, most importantly, making the work that we're doing accessible, transparent, and readily available for answering questions by city leadership or community leaders. So we're real proud of the work that our GIS analyst, Nate Casabir, has done to help us build this hub and tell the story. So we're due for an update of our CWPP, and our coalition's discussing that. We're leaning towards having more of a living CWPP than our traditional, 3-ring binder that stays on the shelf unless you need to reference it. So how do we turn our planning into living efforts that other partners are actively contributing to, participating in, and bringing visibility to both the risk and the solutions that are being implemented across Austin and Travis County to protect our communities.